'cause the future's ours to write if we learn to read between the lines.
This is Between the Lines, and we're stepping into one of the most complex and controversial stories in modern Australian history. It begins in 2001, after September 11, 2001, when Australia commits to a war in Afghanistan that would last 2 decades. Between 2006 and 2012, Australia's elite special forces are deployed into some of the most dangerous environments on earth. Among them, Ben Roberts-Smith, a soldier who would go on to receive the Victoria Cross and become one of the most recognised war figures in the country. But in 2008, everything changes. Investigations by The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Canberra Times bring forward serious allegations, later echoed in the 2020 Brereton report, which finds credible information of unlawful killings by some of Special Forces personnel. What follows is a 5-year defamation battle, one of the longest and most expensive in Australian history, reportedly costing hundreds of millions, backed on one side by powerful media interests and fought on the other by major national publications. In 2023, the court rules on a civil standard that key allegations are substantially true. And now the story moves into the next phase: criminal investigations, potential prosecutions, and questions that go far beyond one man. What really happened in Afghanistan? How do we judge decisions made in war years later in peace? And where does it sit between media, military and the law? This isn't just a case, it's a timeline that stretches from the battlefield to the courtroom to the conscience of a nation. And tonight we go between the lines. Joined by Scotty Challen and Luke Lispet. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
So can you give us a little bit of background about, well, first of all, thank you for your service to both of you, for your contribution and all those ex-service personnel or current service personnel. Can you give us a little bit about your background and your service and what it was really like over there?
You want to kick off?
Yeah, you start.
Sure. My name's Luke, guys. So I served 14 years in the ADF, ripe old age of 21 when I joined up. I did 4 deployments to the Middle East. So I spent quite a lot of time in Afghanistan, Iraq. Really got to see that side of the world, at a very, very young age, see the effects of what it was like there, what the people were like there, and then also, the support or lack thereof of our Australian troops when they come back from those locations. Today I work in the veterans space, supporting veterans with advocacy, reintegrating them back into the population, and a lot of support services for our veterans, particularly those that have deployed to places like the Middle East.
Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, look, my career was nowhere near as exciting or long as Luke's. I was lucky enough to have done just over 5 years in the Royal Australian Air Force as an Airfield Defence Guard, ADG they call them. I didn't deploy, I never saw combat, and I got out in 04. I don't regret the time that I had in. I was there for a lot of really interesting stuff. East Timor, September 11, the build up to the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq. But the way some military careers work, some people get to go, some people don't. And I guess I consider myself lucky that I didn't deploy, because to be in all honesty, having seen what I've seen, especially in the guys over the years that I've known and served with and guys that we're in still, is not great outcomes for a lot of people that come through this stuff. And I think the continuation of this with the Ben Roberts-Smith stuff in the last couple of weeks really highlights to me, and having spoken to so many people, how fragile this whole topic is, how badly our Defence Force has been kind of let down by our government, the systems and the bureaucracy in this country, and that we're going to see a continuation of some really bad social, cultural and family outcomes, for good people around the place. And look, I've been lucky to have done well in business since I got out, and we've done a lot of work with veterans charities. We're very proud of what we've done with that, and we'll continue to support them and help them. But I think this is a really important moment in Australia, especially with our Australian culture, about how we play this going forward, because there's an opportunity right now for our society to get wrecked really badly with what's happening here.
Yeah. Okay, so can I ask, what's the psychological and operational reality of serving in Afghanistan that civilians will never fully grasp?
Look, it's a totally different world over there, right? And you've got to firstly remember that a lot of the information people are getting or acting on is coming from sources like social media, right? Like mainstream media, like the government. And just remember, these are the same sources that told everyone not too long ago to roll up your sleeves and take 8 booster shots of Bill Gates' finest, right? How did that go for you?
Yeah.
So I would, say to people, have some discernment when you do take information in, what you're acting on, and don't fall for that divide and conquer culture, right? That these media platforms, that even our governments can benefit from. So saying that, taking that to a ground level, I guess, from someone who's spent time there, the enemy, and I say the enemy loosely, right? They were more combatants. The enemy, it's debatable, well, whether we should have been there or not, that's a different story. But the combatants there, the enemy there, they don't operate from conventional rules, right? So if you go to a situation or a landscape like Afghanistan and you try and play by the rules, you play by conventional rules, you have an enemy that doesn't play by those rules, right? And the risk of not playing by the rules is people get shot, innocent people, kids, women, children get murdered, and this continues to occur. What I mean by that, right, is an unconventional enemy. By the general rules of law or the way soldiers should operate, we say conventionally in war, is we shoot each other, and the most dead, well, they lose. When it comes to the enemy or the combatants in places like Afghanistan, these are guys that would tie bombs to school kids, right? Send them into crowds. They don't care about mass casualties. They would strap explosive devices to pregnant women, right, under the burqas to mask bombs. There's rape, there's murder, there's torture, there's people being burnt alive in cages. You're not dealing with someone that just goes out and kills people humanely, right? You are dealing with someone that will try every trick in the book to inflict the maximum amount of pain and torture and suffering as possible. So seeing that, as a soldier on the ground, and a lot of our operators, they're required to play at that level, right? You can't defeat an unconventional enemy by conventional rules. And that's what it looks like on the ground there. Now, coming back, it is a lot to process, right? For a lot of soldiers. You go over there, I was 21 when I went to Iraq. I was 23, sorry. And, you see things that really impact you as a person. So coming back, and reintegrating back into society, the lack of support by our government, a lot of these troops are already paying the price, right? They've gone overseas, they've been impacted, they pay a price that no one can see. So, hearing stories like the Ben Roberts-Smith saga and the way our media, our governments are persecuting our own soldiers, our own Australian men. These are guys that have already paid a significant price. It's very upsetting for a lot of veterans. I think I speak for that, seeing the way that, our government who sent us to these places now turns on us as if it was our decision to go there, right? And, I think there's so many levels of accountability that need to be held. Senior operational leadership in the ADF, the government itself that sent Australian troops there, right? Was it necessary? Were we acting in the best interest of Australia, or was there something else? I think these are a lot of the questions and the doubt that, particularly from the veteran community, we're starting to ask and look at from our government.
Thanks, Luke.
One of the things about this, especially in the last couple of weeks now, you're tying this in with the latest conflict in Iran. And I'm thinking about it, and during the war on terror, I've got to say, as an Australian civilian for the bulk of that, we didn't really hear much about the war. We didn't know much about what was going on in Afghanistan. A lot of us had no idea, or I knew, but a lot of people out there wouldn't have known that these guys were doing multiple deployments, often with short stints in between and then redeploying again. And the missions were changing, the focus was changing, the surge was on, the surge was off. Like this thing was a dynamic war that most Australians had no idea was happening at the time. And I was always aware of the fact that we were kind of living in our isolated bubble, just doing our Australian thing without any real concept that we had troops in harm's way. You know, we had men overseas that were fighting for our country, our Australian Defence Force. And I would imagine now that there's a lot of Australians that are looking at this going, oh, I had no idea. I didn't realise it was like that. I didn't realise that we were sending these guys on 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 deployments, you know, with very, very short spaces in between that. And what the psychological damage of doing multiple deployments and then coming back to society were again.
Yes.
Emotions on, emotions off, emotions on, emotions off. And so we've got a generation of guys that have gone through this stuff. And now you're hearing much more about this, what our involvement was in the war on terror and in Afghanistan because of what's happening with Ben Roberts-Smith and since the defamation case. And this is a terrible thing for Ben to go through, his family to go through, for veterans to be going through. But as a society, I would say that it's probably something that we have to confront, because if we're going to live in a country that allows itself to do this kind of stuff to Australian veterans, then we need to have a really good hard look at ourselves and think about what we want the future of our country to look like. Because to be honest with you, if this is the standard going forward, you can't have any confidence in the systems that are running this place.
Well, that's the good point. The theme of the conversation is, you know, Ben Roberts-Smith, war hero, war criminal, or scapegoat.
Yeah.
But there's some information that's been passed on to me, and it's been asked to be kept anonymous. But I just wanted to share that with you, share this with you as well. The fuse, and it's a little bit long-winded, but I'll just get through it anyway. The fuse under Ben Roberts-Smith wasn't lit overnight; it was lit over a decade ago. What we're really looking at here isn't just one soldier; it's an entire chain of command stretching from battlefield in Afghanistan all the way back to Canberra and beyond. There's a strong argument that Australian SAS units were effectively operating within US border objectives, particularly in high-risk, high-enemy operations. That arrangement offered something very convenient for Washington: plausible deniability. And back home, the Australian military leadership and political figures were reportedly comfortable receiving positive briefings while maintaining distance from the operational reality on the ground. In other words, we're proud of the results, but we don't want to know how they're achieved. Now, in hindsight, that position becomes incredibly difficult to defend, because under international law, particularly war crimes conventions, a nation can avoid external prosecution only if it demonstrates it is willing and available to investigate itself. If it doesn't, then that's when institutions like the International Criminal Court can step in. We've seen that precedent before, even in governments once celebrated on a global stage like Burma, with Suu Kyi, found themselves answering to The Hague when internal accountability fell short. So what happens when a country realises it hasn't been asking the questions for years? It starts asking them fast. There's a broader context many point to when discussing the Brereton report, not just as an inquiry into alleged actions on the ground, but as a mechanism to demonstrate accountability on a national level. Because without that, the consequences escalate far beyond individual soldiers. Now let's talk leadership. Australia's involvement in Afghanistan was formalised under John Howard, and years later we saw prominent voices, including his, supporting accountability processes. Now here's the uncomfortable question. Can political and military leadership distance themselves from operational conduct and then claim ignorance when things go wrong? History suggests otherwise. Special forces like SAS were designed to be deployed as a continuous... Special forces like the SAS were never designed to be deployed as a continuous frontline assault force. Their doctrine is built around precision, short strategic missions, and often intelligence-based. Yet over time, deployments became relentless: high tempo, high pressure, repeated exposure. And when you push elite units beyond their intended role year after year, the system itself starts to fracture. So when allegations surface, who carries the weight? Because as David McBride, and we'll have Eddie Lloyd, David McBride's lawyer, joining us shortly via live stream, because as David McBride argued, it's often the soldiers on the ground who are left exposed, while those higher up the chain remain insulated. That dynamic isn't new. It echoes all the way back to Breaker Morant in 1902. Executed under controversial circumstances, widely believed by some to have been sacrificed to protect those above him. And that raises the central tension in the Robert Smith case. Is justice being served, or is the system protecting itself? Because when hundreds of millions of dollars are spent navigating legal battles, it forces a deeper question: what's really being defended, truth or reputation? As the ancient Greek Aeschylus once said, in war, truth is the first casualty. And as Julian Assange put it more recently, if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth. So the real question isn't just about one man, it's this: are we willing to follow the truth all the way up the chain, or only as far as it's convenient? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it doesn't. What's the agenda at play here? I mean, I keep coming back to that in my mind as well. Is what the timing, obviously, and what we're looking at now. And my personal opinion is pretty simple about this. You learn from your mistakes and you go forward. You know, the precedents here that we're currently doing in our society with regards to how we're handling this Ben Robert Smith case, there is no precedence for this in Australian history, Australian military, our culture of our country. You know, you touch on Breaker Morant, different time, different period, but still, what are we trying to achieve here? Because if you're going to try and weaken us as a country, this is exactly how you do it. If asymmetrical warfare, try and undermine your society, your systems and your processes, this is exactly how you do it. This is how you do it. Yeah. And so I don't trust anything that's coming out of this, and for us to carry on this way, if mistakes were made, we learn from it, we don't do that next time. That's the way it should be handled as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I was joking with John Shipton about it. It's sort of like halfway between the two movies, Breaker Morant and Wag the Dog, with Dustin Hoffman and
100%.
And Robert De Niro. Yeah. Luke?
Yeah, look, I look at it. I like to look at the events that have occurred and the timing of them and what actually happened, right? Which I think raises some big questions. The lead up to Anzac Day, right? When a nation comes together to celebrate and remember our veterans, and you pull this out. The shock and awe of the arrest at the airport, right? Media crew already there.
Yes.
The trial by media we've seen, right? How heavy this has gone in media headlines and social media. That agenda of pick a side, divide and conquer. All these things, I think, raise questions. What is really the aim of this, right? What is trying to be achieved here? I don't think it's just to get to the bottom of the truth. I think there's a bigger agenda at hand, particularly, the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on this, the timing of it all. I just think there's a bigger issue at play here.
Yes, absolutely. Eddie Lloyd's joining us as well. Hi, Eddie. Thanks for joining us. I'm not sure how much of that you caught, but thank you for taking the time to join us. And so thank you for joining us and having the conversation. Of course, you're the lawyer for David McBride. Can you give us a little bit of backstory for those who are uninitiated?
Yeah, well, David McBride is at the tail end of his non-parole period in Canberra jail at the moment, and he, of course, was convicted, or he pleaded guilty to essentially communicating information of a sensitive nature to the ABC journalist, who then produced the Afghan file story. So he got a head sentence of 5 years and 8 months, and his non-parole period expires in August this year. So he is just sitting there day by day, doing very well, as he's a very strong man and mentally. He's coping with the onerous conditions in a prison and the lack of liberty, as best as he can, thankfully to the support of many people that, send him postcards and keep letting him know that they're on his side. And we all wait with eager anticipation for the real criminals here, the leadership of the ADF, to be held account for all of the information that he has leaked and been responsible for what's happened to the soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Did you guys have any questions? So, I mean, the irony, of course, is in relation to the Ben Robert Smith matter.
Yeah.
And then you've got David McBride, who's
been incarcerated for potentially exposing war crimes. I'm just wondering, like, they're both two opposite ends of the spectrum, but also directly related.
Well, there is a commonality between both the cases. And of course, I'm following very closely what happens in the Ben Roberts-Smith case. And as a lawyer, I can tell you, if I had a crystal ball and looked ahead 5 years, the whole thing is going to disappear. There is no way that that prosecution can be sustained when you look at the issues of credibility, when you look at the issues of delay, and when you look at the ridiculous closed court kind of situation of the state secrets, the amount of money, I just can't see that prosecution finalising any way but a withdrawal of charges. But it will be a long time before that. Of course, what they both have in common, and I think one of the reasons why the prosecution will ultimately fail, I think right now this is a bit of a theatre performance for everyone. I think the prosecution will also fail because there's a lot of people in the leadership and in politics that know a lot of information. And Ben Roberts-Smith knows who they are, and David McBride know who they are. David McBride tried to speak out, and this is what happened to him. So I would say Ben Roberts-Smith could bring the whole house of cards down with this trial.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Just for backstory here, how long's David been going through this legal process for now? How long's it been from beginning to where we are today?
12 years, this long march for justice, and it's not over until it's not over. You know, he'll get released. He's never going to get justice through the courts. It's been very disappointing as a lawyer to be in this, involved in his case as his lawyer, to see the failure of the system, of the criminal injustice system, really, on him. And how the government can just come in and cherry pick what they say is secret and what isn't, to create a narrative that gets released to the media for a certain purpose, for a certain agenda, to cover up certain actions of certain people.
It's a clear example of the process being the punishment, isn't it? I mean, we want justice, but we want swift justice, we want outcomes, and we want resolutions to these things. And we all know that in Australia, in the current legal system, almost every functioning part of our society that doesn't function, in my opinion, this is what you get. You get years and years of protracted BS that never ends, in a cycle that's designed to break you, wreck your family, wreck your businesses, and wreck everything around you as it rolls on, protecting the wrong people and ruining good people.
And of course, there's pain and punishment before the judge hits the gavel down. Of course, in this 12 long years that McBride has been walking, when he tried to speak up, he just, the psychological gaslighting began. They sending him to psychiatrists all over Australia, separating from his family, isolating him, having secret conversations, keeping him on the outside, like all of that kind of beginning of gaslighting within the organisation, and then the gaslighting from the AFP, and then the gaslighting from the judiciary. It's, he's sitting there. It's a very dangerous thing to try to speak the truth in this country. Very dangerous. And, it's very sad because what it's told me is that, we are obviously in an autocracy right now. There is no way in the world that I would call our government a democracy when we have those three pillars, the judiciary, the courts, and the police and the executive. There has to be somewhere for the citizens to turn to when there's been a law that's been unjustly applied, like David McBride, or there is like a citizen has been wrongly wrongly accused. We go to the courts for justice. But when we have the government going in there and treading on that territory, which is not their territory to tread on, or deciding what the evidence will be and what won't be before the judge, we have a complete failure of our democracy, because there is nowhere for the citizen to turn to get justice anymore, with the government overarching their power and getting into the court's discretion. So I find that a very frightening state of play. It could work for some people, I'm not sure, but I would say all of those factors are going to come into play in the Ben Roberts-Smith trial, 100%.
Can I ask you a question from a legal perspective as well too, please, Eddie? Given that Ben Roberts-Smith's father was former Major General Leonard Roberts-Smith, who was a former Supreme Court Justice in Western Australia, and you sort of alluded to it. I'm just wondering, like, how much of this is factual and how much of it's politically motivated?
I'd say the prosecution of David McBride and Ben Roberts-Smith is 100% politically motivated. Right or wrong, whether those prosecutions in both cases be right or wrong, the agenda behind them is not about the person. It's not about getting someone justice. It's really about a political agenda. For David McBride, it was really about him not speaking out and the cover-up. So many people that he wanted to point to, that he wanted to come to the trial to give evidence about, the cover-up of the crimes that were happening in Afghanistan. I'm not just talking about the allegations against Ben Roberts-Smith, but a lot of different people that and also, what people really miss in the David McBride case is his overarching complaint was actually he wanted to tell the Australian people that this war is BS. That this is just propaganda, that we are sending our soldiers over tour after tour after tour, back to back with hardly any psychological debriefing, and they arrive there and completely disillusioned. What are they here for? They thought they were going to fight war. For McBride, he wanted to be a soldier since he was 5 years old. He had these little soldier toys. So he was just like completely his illusion shattered when he went to war and realised that it was all just BS. And the war was only continuing because they were there. And there was no dignity in war. And I think that really impacted many, many people in the ADF. And I think that kind of led to a bit of a culture of, dissatisfaction and unruly behaviour, because it was pretty difficult for soldiers to be there, honouring their country and realising that they're doing actually the opposite by being there.
Yes. So I want to ask you guys as well, like, do you think that there's potentially any alternate agenda there to not only destabilise the alpha males, but also like foreign influences in relation to diminishing the reputation and trust in the ADF?
Yeah, 100%. But it's also an indication to the rest of society that they can do whatever they want to whoever they want, whenever they feel like it, and there's nothing you can do about it. And whether that's 18 days out from Anzac Day or 12 years ago with David, the reality is this government, successive uniparty governments, the powers that be in this country, they hold you in contempt. They don't think you have any value, and you're just a pawn for their nefarious purposes to create whatever it is that they're working towards. You talk about a political objective here. We all can see that. We feel it. We sense it. Anzac Day has been under attack for years now, and this is just another part in that. It furthers that agenda, but also furthers the agenda to try and undermine your country as a sovereign nation, and for a society that can defend itself in what is becoming a really very difficult geostrategic area in a very uncertain globe. There's bigger forces at play here, and I'll be honest with you, if they're winning, because when you look at this stuff, they're winning. But conversations like this are the only way we can literally fight back at this point.
That's exactly right. You're so on the money there, and I think it's just a few people with the agenda as well. There's no way that the Australian government is acting in our interest in anything that's going on now, and I don't think anywhere in the past as well. I think that wars have really come down to the personal agenda of a few powerful people. And I think the timing is really illuminating in terms of the political interference in cases like this. So with David McBride, when he was just about to go to trial, the government had a certain media narrative that they wanted to carry out around David McBride, what evidence was let in and out. They were all deciding. They were all consulted, the Attorney General's Department, Mark Dreyfus at the time, who had like 3 hats on, interfering in all of the processes there. But it was very interesting because there was the oversight panel report to the Afghanistan inquiry came out, was given to the government, just a few days before David's trial. And that report actually vindicated him because David McBride, the core of his complaint was this war is BS and it's propaganda. And why are you targeting the low-hanging fruit of soldiers? What about all of the leadership? So that independent oversight panel report revealed that those 3 experts said the Afghanistan inquiry should have held leadership accountable. You can't just point the finger at, a bad soldier here and there. It goes all the way up to the chain. And so that report they sat on until the day of his sentence, I think, that the day of his sentence, I think they released it because they didn't want the media having that narrative to run in the background. But maybe what David McBride was complaining about had some merit to it. So that was a very obvious decision of government to politically interfere in the case of David McBride to ensure that the media narrative was consistent with how they were persecuting him.
Yeah, and Eddie, I can absolutely echo what you said. You know, I did 4 deployments to the Middle East, and after every trip I came home, I asked myself, what the hell were we doing there? What was the point of that? As I know many other veterans did as well.
Yeah.
What people don't get is the impact of these soldiers, right? And a number that's quite alarming and not many people will know of is that, you know, over the last 30 years, we've had over 1,800 ADF veterans commit suicide. 1,800. That's the impacts these wars have on our Australian men, our Australian women and children. You know, and I actually went to a friend's funeral yesterday who I served with, one of my troops. He went to Afghanistan, and you know, this is the impact on the ground that it has for Australian men and women. But the thing is, what people really need to remember is who sent our Defence Force to these wars. It was the Australian government, right? So any accountability for all actions of war, I think, should fall back to the Australian government.
Yeah, I mean, it's outrageous that the Prime Minister alone has the decision to send us to war or not. I know the Greens have been doing some work behind the scenes, hopefully with some independent support, you know, to get something up to stop that from happening. You know, this is something that the whole of government should be informed of before leading us into a war that, you know, costs trillions of money, trillions of dollars, and we lose so many lives. And what you're talking about, that injury, and I'm so sorry that you went to war and had to experience that. Like, it's just devastating. Like, it's a real dishonor to you as a human being that you go to something with all of the courage that you have to do this important job, risk your life, and you get there and you get so disillusioned. I think that's what, you know, that's why it's called moral injury. Like, you go there with good morals to go and do something, you get this moral injury because it's not what you thought it was, and yet you've got to stay there and make something of it. And I mean, I'm not sure what your experience is with counselling and things like that. Like, as I understand it, the debriefing from these tours are pretty minimal and surface level, and you're just sent back again and again and again. And I just think that's very dangerous. Yeah.
Thanks, Eddie. Can I ask you the question as well? You might have missed it because we touched on it earlier in the conversation, but following the accountability, like the first question is why we're even in Afghanistan in the first place. That's another rabbit hole about 9/11, which we won't touch today. But and those that know. But from a legal perspective, like, and we also referenced, you know, what we're experiencing is somewhere between the movies Break a Morant and Wag the Dog. And what recourse is there, or what actions available, rather than like having these guys on the front line wear the brunt of it, rather than following it all the way up the chain of the command, including the then Prime Minister John Howard at the time? How are they unable to be prosecuted?
Held accountable. Yeah. So I think the course is through the international I can't remember the court as I sit here, Criminal Justice Court, perhaps. And I think in June of 2023, Jackie Lambie stood with Rex Patrick on the steps of Parliament and filed a complaint about the lack of accountability to leadership. And that includes politicians as well, not just ADF leadership, because all of them know everything. Trust me, all of them know everything that happened, and none of them want to be held accountable. And that is why, in my view, the Brereton inquiry was set up in such a narrow way, where they get Mr. Brereton in there to head up this little secret inquiry where his remit is so small and narrow that he's not actually allowed to, you know, investigate anyone above the, you know, commando level. Like, that's it, you know. And there are a lot of complaints from many ADF soldiers about that no, you've got to get the leadership. They, at the end of the day, you know, they had I can't remember the case, it's a principle where, you know, even if they didn't know the leadership, they ought to have known, and they're the ones that should be getting prosecuted. So Jackie Lambie and Rex Patrick, on behalf of, I think, Glenn Kolomowitz, did the application to be heard in the court. the Brereton inquiry, when there's something going on in the domestic state Australia, like the Brereton inquiry, they don't really have any jurisdiction to enter the international court because they say, well, you're doing something already about it. But if that is so hopeless, so pathetic, there is a way of getting in. But they've tried every avenue to get into the court because that is the only way that you'll have higher up people being held accountable. But that's being played around with, you know, like there's someone in there that's talking to someone over here. And there's, you know, they've shut that option down. So it's very difficult. I think in terms of justice in 2026, we have to stop looking at the courts and government to help us out there and, you know, really take on some more agency as individuals and jump on board to cases like Dave McBride. I'm always happy to do interviews like this because there is nobody else talking about this stuff. The media, they have just completely failed us. Like, really, I blame them for a lot, you know. They're not independent anymore. It's you guys and Michael West Media and a few others that I encourage people to listen to get the actual truth. And I think I just think it's the more we hope for our government to change and for the system to change, the more we're going to be let down because the powerful are so powerful. They really are. And they, you know, the only thing is for people power. That's what I believe in today, is that we've just got to get the message out to everybody because everybody is asleep. They don't even know that we're sliding into this autocracy at the moment. They don't realize. So it's education. I'm very, very big on schools, you know, bringing back in civics education so people can understand what it's meant to look like in a democracy, that political donations influence power and money, and to be aware of that. And to really get children to understand the separation of powers doctrine so that they can see quicker, you know, what's happened in this McBride case, that the government shouldn't be allowed to go into the court's jurisdiction and take evidence, that breaks down our democracy. So.
Can I just ask a question here? One of the things that you touched on before, Eddie, was the unlimited resources that a government like this can bring to bear against a citizen and prosecute its narrative, you know, to unlimited ends with taxpayer dollars. I mean, in my mind, this stuff should be capped somewhere. If it's going to take this much to put a person away or to prosecute your argument, then I would question the value of the argument or question the benefits of it. And if we're going to use the narrative that no one is above the law, then what you're really doing is giving, you know, a nefarious force potentially a blank checkbook to be able to persecute anybody that they want. And I think that we need to have some limits on that, because there's no way that we should be spending hundreds of millions of dollars to prosecute people in this type of instance or with these type of crimes, where especially when we see people who do commit real crimes, rapes, murders, machete attacks,
white collar crime,
community, you know, hours, you know, after they've committed the crime. So how do we, you know, is this an idea that should be considered, is capping the process here?
Well, I think what you're touching on is something that is actually meant to be in existence now, like the rule of law. Everyone should be equal before the law. That's all that needs to happen. Everyone just do your job. You stay in your corner, government, and do your thing. You stay in your corner, executive, do your thing. And you stay in your corner, judiciary, and do your thing. And the media, you know, should not be involved, but they are, because the government are giving them the narrative that they are then spinning for their own agenda. So if we just apply the rule of law, then we don't have this problem. That's where it begins and ends. And in McBride's case, he was seeing a lot of soldiers being prosecuted when they hadn't done anything wrong, when the threshold of reasonable suspicion hadn't even been met. And he was complaining about that. There's a misapplication of the rule of law here. Some people are being prosecuted and other people are not. Some people appear to be innocently prosecuted while other people are not. So that's the core of everything. But how do we get back there? That's why I say education, kids, you know, that's what I think we need to be. Why isn't politics like a core unit for every child? Like, why don't they understand this stuff? Because with more awareness, like you and I know what's going on, it's so obvious, you know, this is just the rule of law. That's as basic as it is. And that's something we should be teaching people all over Australia. We wouldn't be in this situation if we all had a proper education in democracy and civics. We just wouldn't. People would be voting informed vote, true informed vote. At the moment, they're not. It's like, who's got the biggest ads on TV? Who's grabbing their attention? You know, and there's a lot of hardworking politicians out there that don't have the money to do that, but they're never going to get in power, you know. So I could just talk all day about that, the breakdown of our democracy. Don't even get me started.
Did you ever get in trouble when you were in the military, Luke?
Oh, look, there was a few times I got in trouble. Yeah. What?
Well, I guess the point being is that, I mean, I recall when I was in and people did get in trouble and I got in a bit of trouble as well. The application of justice was swift in the military.
Yes.
It didn't mess around.
No, it was black and white. There was no grey.
Didn't take 10 years.
It could take 10 years. Sometimes it would take 2 weeks.
I mean, why wasn't Ben Roberts-Smith and Dave McBride dealt with that way? Like there was plenty of remit for David to be dealt with in the military jurisdiction, but 12 years later, here we are.
Okay, so can I ask you this question from a legal viewpoint too, please, Eddie? Why is the AFP involved in matters like David McBride and Ben Roberts-Smith? Where's the AFP jurisdiction? Why wasn't it looked after by military tribunals?
It was kind of like a media narrative that led to the prosecution in both cases, as I understand it.
By media.
Yeah, this is not the proper way. Exactly. They're so powerful. They should have been dealt with. But this is where you see the narrative, and this is where you see the real agenda illuminating. Even though we might not be able to name the specific agenda, I think it's about covering up other people's crimes, personally, higher up and protecting their powerful positions. But that's exactly where you see it. It's like, of course, this is not the place of the AFP. This should have been dealt with at the beginning by the military jurisdiction. So soldiers are not responsible for that. That's the leadership that are making decisions or not making decisions there that have then led to these delayed prosecutions by the AFP. So, yeah.
Okay. Do you guys have any other questions at all?
No,
that's good. So anything else you'd like to share with us in closing, Eddie?
Look, I'll send this out to as many people as I know. Thank you for being independent in this space and continuing to try and share the message. And, we've just got to still support Dave McBride. He's out in August. He's going to need a lot of support. And for me, as I say, justice is, we've got to really, change our definition and our view of what justice is. I think for David McBride, justice is coming from the people. It's coming from the validation of the people. It's never going to come. We went all the way up to the High Court. It was never a fair trial. Justice is going to come from the people, I think, in these cases. So it's just empowering the people to understand they have that amount of power in a democracy, and to support David when he comes out of custody, to make sure that we've got his back and we know that the government is rotten and, he shouldn't have been.
Yeah. Well, it's refreshing to have a conversation with someone that's so awake and aware around these matters, particularly from the legal profession. And thank you for your contribution and service to David McBride. I've had several conversations with him as well. So I know that he's very appreciative of your contribution to him. And thanks for making your time to join us in this conversation.
Yeah, great to be with you. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Eddie.
Cheers.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Okay. So what do you think?
I just remembering something that happened, and you'd remember this as well. Do you remember when we got the text message from DVA to tell us that the Afghanistan war was over?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, look, I think when we heard the Afghan war was over, you'd expect celebration and all the good things. It really raised questions for me and a lot of us that how can we be at war with a country for 20 odd years, and then suddenly within several days, these Afghani Taliban were able to take back the country, and obtain tanks. I think there were helicopters, weapons. For the first time we've seen troops at the airport standing side by side with Taliban, not shooting at each other. That was unheard of, right? And when you have convinced the world that, hey, these guys are the bad guys, we're sending our men, our women and children to fight overseas, to die, to come back and experience the impacts of it. But in 2 days' time, we go, well, actually, they weren't so bad after all. We're just going to give the country back to them. That was a spit in the face for a lot of veterans, right, who had sacrificed so much serving what they believed was serving their country, to then hearing that we just gave it back to them, that all those deaths were almost in vain, that all the impacts of the mental health was in vain. And, for me, when I heard that and seen how fast they were able to hand it back to them and said they were okay, that raised a lot of questions for me, particularly what I heard on the media, right? And what came out at that time was, the Taliban, they're not so bad. They're educating the girls, they're putting them back into schools, they're feeding the population. I had a Afghan person who I met whilst I was in country, who I was still in communication with. And he had been trying to flee the country for quite some time. And I said, Motazim was his name. I said, Mot, tell me about the Taliban takeover, right? Is it as peaceful as they say? Are the women and children back into schools? And he said, Luke, he said, they're coming through the streets and they're finding out who worked with the coalition forces. They're hanging them up in the middle of the street, cutting their eyeballs out and melting their IDs to their chest. And this was from on the ground. So in that moment, I kind of really got present to what we were being told in the media and what was actually the truth on the ground. And that shocked me. And, you know, naturally I had lost a lot of trust and faith in the media and in our government at that time.
Yep.
We got a text message. You know, everyone that was on the DVA books probably at that point, and although I was well and truly out by many years at this stage, we got a text message to say that the war in Afghanistan was over, and that if you're feeling depressed or worried about that, ring this number. Thank you very much for your service. And you know, and it was a longer message. There was obviously a bit more to it, but that was essentially the nuance of it. And that was the, oh shit, the war's over. The text message just said so. Now, I'd been out long enough to, you know, not really have any demons from my service, but all I thought about was I could only imagine what that felt like for guys that had deployed multiple times, marriages lost, suicide, friends, all the rest of it. And it got me thinking a little bit about my granddad. And I know I'm segueing a little here, but he was a Vietnam veteran. He served in Vietnam in 69, 70. I can only imagine what it must have felt like watching the fall of Saigon in 75 when they were scrambling out of Vietnam, South Vietnam, as that thing crumbled. And we're seeing the same kind of vision in Afghanistan. Just thinking, wow, we're going to do this shit all over again, just the same way, you know. And now we're persecuting veterans after the fact as well, you know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too because, and I know Luke covered off on like being there, and it still raises the question that's not answered: is what were we doing in Afghanistan apart from foreign interests?
Raytheon share price, mate.
Yes. Yes. Raytheon share prices. Yeah. But like, what's the difference now with what we're dealing with Iran? Given that the US looks like it's going to enforce a draft come the end of this year.
Portfolio's up 80%.
Yes. That's all that matters.
I hate to sound facetious about that. I mean, I hate it that that's actually the case. But I'm in group chats with people that are literally talking about the next buy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like,
it's
friggin' sick.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, you've got to, you know, look at the general consensus of the population. Ask people, do you believe we should be at war with Iran? Should we send Australian troops overseas again?
Well, we're there in the Middle East already.
We're there in the Middle East already. But, you know, what is the opinion of the population here? I don't think really anyone says we should be. Yet here we are being told again to go back overseas, to go into foreign interests. Is it a foreign war? I'd say yes. Iran poses no threat to Australia that I can see.
No.
So, you know, these are the questions that need to be asked. At what point is there an overstep? Is there an overreach and a abuse or manipulation of our Australian Defence Force?
There's people that think this war is dandy in Australia. I've spoken to them, and, you know, given the work that I do, I get to meet a lot of different people, and they think this thing is fine, that it's a noble war, that the Iranian people want liberty and freedom, and that this is the way to achieve that for them. And I think that everyone's got a really short memory in Australia, and I'm questioning that 6 weeks after this thing's kicked off in Iran now, and we can look back on all of the things that have happened. And I think those of us that don't understand history are doomed to repeat it again. And I can just see us bumbling along straight into this bullshit again, you know. And so anyone out there who's actually cheering for this right now, I think you should stop, read a little bit of history and look back on some of the footage from the fall of Vietnam, the fall of Afghanistan, and have a look at how Iraq and Libya and Syria are looking today, mate.
Yes.
The bastions of freedom that we've dropped bombs on and created democracy.
Killing 1 million Iraqis and 500,000 Syrians.
And look what happened with Libya, right? You know, Gaddafi said that Libya is the plug that stops basically Africa from migrating through to Europe. And look at the problems that Europe is having now because we destabilised Libya. I mean, how did that work out, right?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Okay, I recorded an interview earlier with John Shipton, Julian Assange's father as well, so he touches on some interesting topics in this conversation. So we'll have a listen to this and then I'll seek your comments further about that as well. Thanks.
John Shipton, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure and good to see you, Paul.
Good to see you also.
So here we are. We're talking about the recent turn of events with Ben Roberts-Smith and the amount of attention that it's been getting recently. But I know, in light of your experience in the world and that sort of thing at the moment, I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, how do high-class cases intersect with political narratives?
Well, in the case where state interests are involved, everything falls into place or comports to those interests. So the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Defence, the courts all comport to what Australia's state interests are, and this our state interests are outlined in our doctrine and our strategic interests, and the papers published and the think tanks that make recommendations surrounding that. So our principal defence and trade interests have been China and the United States. In Australia, defence is totally integrated with the United States, to the point where now, realising that the United States weapons systems are inadequate, its strategic capacities are poor, having lost two strategic wars, one in Ukraine, where they tried to destroy Russia, and one in Iran, where they tried to destroy Iran. And they've shown an incapacity to negotiate and a willingness to be mendacious and murderous. So I imagine that Australian strategic analysts are now going over their books and reviewing the circumstances of our engagement with the United States, and subtly, or sneaking around the place, if you like, to work out a way to remove ourselves somewhat from the United States and engage with Southeast Asia and China in a more productive and less suspicious fashion. So that's that circumstance outlined. So I see on the ABC a day before yesterday, they announced that there was going to be a massive shake-up in the army. Also, I read that now a couple of generals are under suspicion in the engagement, in Australia's engagement with Afghanistan and the United States. Ben Roberts, of course, is being charged with murder, and that'll come before the courts, and there will be intense interest in what unfolds there.
Yes. Can I ask you as well, John, I mean, given like your experience that you've had with Julian and that sort of thing over the last 15 or 16 years or whatever it's been now as well, do you think there's something, a great agenda or narrative at play, rather than, I mean, given the fact that we've been dealing with incongruencies. I mean, there's John Howard did the 90-year suppression orders and that sort of thing as well. There seems to be a bit of a double standard here.
Yeah, well, when the state interests collide with the geopolitical changes that are unstoppable and vast, then the state has to quickly get an understanding of where it stands in the current geopolitical circumstances and how they imagine that will unfold. So I think that is the starting point for any investigation. We could presume ourselves that the demonstration of the weapons systems of the United States and its weapons in Ukraine has been deficient. They have, I think I read yesterday that there's 29,000 tanks and armored vehicles being destroyed by Russia in Ukraine. a vast amount of destruction, it would indicate to us that the drawdown of weapons has been so great that they can't fight a war with Iran successfully, because they just haven't got the weapons stockpiled. They can only have left gravity bombs. They can't fly their planes over Iran for fear of being shot out of the sky. So those understandings were being examined in Canberra or wherever the strategic analysis takes place in Australia. I assume it's Canberra.
Yes.
Yeah. And thus far, the only manifestation of that review having some depth is the shake-up of the Australian Army and the prosecution of the VC, we know Roberts. So you will, and also I think in the ABC online portal, the news portal, mentioning that generals were being investigated as to whether they can be prosecuted. But I'll just add this, that the conclusion in the Brereton report, which I understand from memory, was that the NCOs deceived the hierarchy, the army hierarchy. So the NCOs deceived the army hierarchy and carried out these 39 murders. But this is not possible. And David McBride, before he went to jail, made a series of 2-minute videos where he covered the fact that it is simply impossible for the hierarchy, the army hierarchy, generals, majors, and colonels, and so on, not to know. For they have information streams which coalesce within their offices, within their under their auspices. So, for example, they have the video cameras on the soldiers. They have drones overhead. They have reports from the translators. They have reports from the Americans. They have reports from the local villages, and all of those reports coalesce and are on the desks of the army hierarchy, so they cannot not know. The second thing is that in 2000, before the invasion of Afghanistan by United States and Australia, the production of heroin was about 12% of the world total. The Taliban had repressed the production of heroin. Sometime later, according to the United Nations report, it rose to be 90% under the occupation of Afghanistan by Australia and the United States. That is, and also reports from Russia, which I think are important to understand, is that in 2006, the importation of heroin into Russia via Georgia was practically nil. And by 2007, it had rose to 20 tons. So the Georgian mafia was facilitating the distribution of heroin in Russia. Now, we understand that this is the second time that the United States and United Kingdom have used opium addiction as a strategic attack on an enemy that they want to plunder. And the first one was the 2 opium wars in China. Well, the attempt to debauch the Russian youth and Iranian youth subsequently rather failed. So it became the occupation of Afghanistan became a burden, so that they began then to leave. It was unprofitable. But I would assert that a principal strategic reason for us being in Afghanistan was the growth and distribution of heroin in order to debauch the youth of our enemies, Russia and Iran. They're not my enemies. They're given to me as an enemy by the state interests of Australia and the United States. Now, this strategy, it works its way into the moral fibre of the occupation troops. They're walking amongst many photos on the internet of the soldiers walking amongst poppy fields that are being harvested.
Yes, or even rumours of them protecting the fields, John.
Yes, also, you need, for such a vast amount of heroin, you need distribution networks, you need banks to put money in, you need banks to distribute money to bribes to politicians and bureaucrats. You need factories to convert it, to make it transportable. You need throughways that are safe, where it won't be confiscated. I believe it mostly went to Camp Bond steel that didn't go into Georgia, into Russia via Georgia. So all of these organizational elements must be involved. So it's vast,
yes,
and trackable. The money flows have to be trackable. So how you could say the corrosion of the moral fibre of the troops would be clear to the hierarchy of the army.
yes,
But the relationship, the hierarchy of the army with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Australia's so-called strategic interests in accommodating what the United States wants, you get what we could call an ecology of corruption. So you would have the politicians facilitating, the institutions of state facilitating, the army engaging with an understanding that this is a state interest, and the men on the ground and up to captain, their moral stature declining because of what they know they're involved in.
yes, yes. It's very interesting, John. Thanks for raising that as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about that too. But let me ask you as well, just in the interest of time, do you see a pattern in how individuals in these instances are being publicly prosecuted?
Well, if we take, for example, the two present prosecutions, the first one of David McBride, he is the whistleblower, which is a term I don't really like, but because the gift that David McBride gave the administration of the army and the institutions of state, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Department of Defense, and the public pressure to renew themselves and get out of this problem that they've created by their association with the United States in Afghanistan. Now, that is a great gift. The prosecution of David is the corrosion of public probity. So David gives the institutions of state an opportunity to take seriously the matter of reform. And as a consequence of the publicity, they prosecute David. and have him put in jail for 5 years. This is beyond sinful, you know. Also, I guess it serves the state some purpose in that it makes other whistleblowers who may be equally morally upright and concerned, it makes them fearful of doing their public duty. I might remind everybody that in Australia we have regulation or laws which can get you 2 years in prison. It's called misprison for not reporting a crime. So you get 2 years in jail for not reporting a crime. And I think that that's a serious matter. They don't have that law in the United States,
Right.
or so I'm told.
Like some type of Good Samaritan law.
Well, no, it is if you see a crime and you don't report it and you get found out, you can be charged with misprison and then get 2 years in the can for that, your troubles or your lack of troubles.
Incredible. Just in closing as well, John, can I ask you your opinion and how does it occur for you at this point in time, given you talked about David McBride? David McBride obviously being an ex-military lawyer that's in prison at the moment. What's happening with Ben Roberts-Smith with a high-profile prosecution, and also in comparison to what's happened with Julian previously with is it collateral damage or the collateral murder video, where I understand none of those people that were involved in any of that any of those things that were documented have ever been brought to task.
No, it seems it seems the most we can hope for is that the publicity that men like David and Chelsea Manning and Julian bring about forces change in the way that the institutions are run. So we can see, I guess, the publicity that befell Ben Roberts-Smith has caused reform to come about. He's being charged. And I think that I feel that maybe after that there'll be others. But that in itself, the charging of a Victoria Cross winner with murder, is in itself a reform brought about by David McBride. And if I could get the imagery correct, a whistleblower like David McBride lifts like Atlas, like Atlas, he lifts up the world and presents it to us in the crimes that have been done. And it's up to us, of course, to thank him and to go about instituting reforms. The only way we can do it is to bring attention and our dissatisfaction to the attention of the institutions of state and parliament and parliamentarians. And consequently, in the same way that the Assange campaign was successful, bring about those changes. But you can't expect anybody to come you can't expect anybody to come and say, thanks, Paul. We enjoyed all that publicity and we've instituted these reforms, and we feel sure that the next 20 years are going to see the Department of Defence run properly and the number of generals reduced to, and so on. There'll be no thanks coming.
Yes. Well, there's thanks to you. Thanks for joining us, John. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for your wisdom and knowledge and your contribution.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Paul.
Thank you, John. Cheers.
Okay, so that was interesting. John Shipton talking about all those things. including the heroin and opium trade out of Afghanistan.
Very interesting.
Yeah. What do you think about that? Did you guys get to see or observe any of that sort of stuff happening?
Yeah, we've seen a few opium fields. There were some operations based around them, but I didn't get to see too much else, or you know. But yeah, it's interesting. It does raise more questions.
Yes. Yeah.
I was in Thailand, Burma, Myanmar last year, up in the original Golden Triangle, right? And they've actually had to create a special economic zone and incentives to bring business into northern Thailand and the Golden Triangle now because they've lost the heroin trade. Where did the heroin trade go? Yeah. Where did that production of opium poppies go? You know, I'd say it probably ended up in Afghanistan.
Look, we don't know.
Yeah. So. Just moving into further comments and that sort of thing, given the trial itself for the criminal trial could be theatre, based on what Eddie's shared before. It could be theatre. And maybe it's distraction. But how do you make peace with the fact of people like Ben Roberts-Smith and David McBride, for that matter, being charged or potentially charged, given the fact that we've had John Howard brought in the suppression orders for 28 high-ranking politicians and judges for suppression orders for pedophilia? I mean, how do you make any sense of that?
I think you've got to separate yourself from that media campaign. You know, that emotional slinging match of shit, where you're getting sucked into taking sides and the nitty-gritty details of it. I would deal with it by zooming out. You know, seeing the forest from the trees and going, well, what's really at place here? Why is this going on? It's very, very easy to get sucked into the details, to become emotional, falling into the trap, right? That takes away your ability to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So for me, it's about zooming out, asking the real questions. Well, what's going on? Why the timing now? Why so much money spent on this? Seeing that forest from the trees, you know.
Yeah. Thanks, Luke.
Well, it brings us back to confidence and trust in institutions and the society that we live in. That's where it lands for me. Look, they want us to be divided, picking a side on this, and we've seen that play out that hard in the last couple of weeks now. You're on Ben's side or you're on their side, and the leftist media, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and they're quoted as, reputable, reporters of journalism and the situation that we're currently in. Now, we all have our own opinion about the validity of these rags, I call them. Shit rags possibly, not even absorbent enough to wipe your ass on. But they have set the narrative, and this mainstream media held the narrative and cultural ground for a really long time, and this alternate media space is leaning towards where we are and pushing back hard on that. The way we fight this is to stay engaged, share the content, share the message, and as Luke said, have conversations that zoom out and look at the bigger picture here as opposed to just the insular nature of this. Also, I want to add, there was another SASR trooper, Oliver Schultz, that was arrested as well.
Yes,
and I've had a few guys that I know that reach out to me and go, don't forget Ollie, and he was well liked and well respected too, and there's a bit more going on behind the scenes there. So, don't fall into the trap of it. This is a divide and conquer mechanism as far as I'm concerned. Have a look at the bigger picture, and let's be really honest about this. The enemy of the Australian people right now is the Australian government and the crime that they're perpetrating on you to wreck your country, wreck your culture, and destroy any hope you have in the future. And they're doing that wholeheartedly, full scale. It's a full frontal assault.
Yeah.
And this is part of that assault.
So the question that people ask, I got your point, Scott, is people are feeling the desperation of it, and what can they do about it, and what's the remedy?
Get involved, get active, be vocal about it, fight the fight. Look, personally, we're running another anti-mass immigration rally. I know it's mass immigration. We've been talking about, obviously the military justice system here and law, but another mass immigration rally down in Canberra, Sunday, the 26th of April, the day after Anzac Day. This will be the fourth event. We've run tens of thousands of people at those events. This is the first one we've done interstate. Turn up and show this government. We know they're not sitting at the moment, but it's not about them sitting. It's about you turning up and showing this government that they're not going to use mass immigration as a weapon to paper over the economic issues we've got here, and as a weapon to build ethnic voting blocks, which entrenches power for them, which undermines your value and hope in this country. We also want to end foreign lobbying, because let's be clear about this. Our involvement in the forever wars was linked to foreign interests. Those foreign interests are bleeding this country dry right now. Turn up. If you can't make it, share the content, share this, share the message, follow guys like Paul and Luke here, and make sure you got eyeballs on, because that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Okay, great. So any further comments, Luke, in closing?
No, I think we've covered a lot. Yeah.
Okay, great. Scott, anything else?
No, thanks very much, Paul. Great
That's
conversation,
been great.
mate.
It's been great. And thank you to both of you. Thank you for Eddie Lloyd for joining us and also for John Shipton's content. Yeah, so just in closing, truth doesn't become truth when the crowd agrees. It stands whether you're ready to face it or not. This isn't about blind defence and it's not about blind condemnation. It's about asking better questions and having the courage to follow them wherever they lead. This is between the lines.
Yeah.
Cheers. And so you just want to do a shout out about the rallies that you touched on before?
Oh, you want me to do another?
Yeah, yeah.
26th of April, 12 p.m, the day after Anzac Day. That's just over 8 days away from today. We are rallying outside Parliament House in Federation Mall. It'll be at 12 p.m. there. You'll see us on the grass on the grounds, and we will be running an anti-mass immigration rally. This rally is also working to end foreign lobbying in Australia, which has a very pervasive and opaque nature in our country that's influencing all three levels of government and not representing you in Australia. You have fringe ideologies and fringe corporate interests that are taking everything from you. Australia is not a better place today than it was 10 years ago, and on its current trajectory, we know it's going to be a worse place in 10 years' time. And unless the good Australians, the people of this country, us, stand together and show this government that we're not prepared to go silently into the night and watch our country disappear into the ether, then we need to come together now. This is your moment. This is a critical moment. We only have a very limited window of opportunity to be able to get some foothold in this fight and to be able to show these guys that we can push back. And then share it. Hundreds of millions of eyeballs on this content. Trust me, it gets to the Prime Minister's office, it gets to Tony Burke's office, it gets to Penny Wong's office, it gets to Chris Bowen's office, and we start shaping and forming the narrative in our country. We don't have to let it go.
Mm. So can I just ask you one question, then we've finished the recording for the official part of the podcast. And that's the dichotomy of the difference between here we are, we've got an immigration problem, which we do, and we've got a housing affordability crisis problem. Given that I'm living between Brisbane and Gold Coast, and there's a couple of tent cities there where working Australians are living in, working out of there in places like Maclean and places like that.
Yep.
What about the irony of the contradiction between we're forcing Australians to go and fight foreign conflicts to create displacement of refugees, to send them into a country, back into Australia again? Like it's the duality of two parts of the same equation, and it's still all coming from the top.
It is, absolutely. And it's undermining your Australian culture. You will not survive this, what's unfolding here. In the middle of this crisis, we're still bringing in 1,500 people a day.
Yeah.
You know, this isn't an argument about racism.
And Albo's given out 50,000, 5% housing loans for them.
Unbelievable.
And he's secured diesel as well, which is enough for, you said 26 hours or something before.
And running a building company, I can tell you right now that all building products that we use have gone up by 20 to 30% in the last 4 weeks, mate.
Yeah.
You know, we have no resilience. The first sign of an international shock and our economy starts to go into convulsions, you're being stolen. Everything's being stolen here. You're being lied to. You're being ripped off.
Yeah.
And so something has to be done about it.
Yep.
Now is the time to do that.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening as well. Please share this content. Thank you.
Stand up, speak out, don't just toe the line, 'cause the future's ours to write if we learn to read between